Good morning. I put this GIF up, or however you want to say it, because when I first got tasked with building an MVP in LiveView, one of the first things I did is I ran through all the hardest things that I thought were going to hit me and make sure I could support worst-case scenarios. Worst-case scenario for me on charts is I have to use D3 in the front end, and I was able to hook this up relatively fast and get it working. Also, GIFs are really good intros, so they can sit there and play while you're waiting for your talk to start. Anyway, here we go. My talk is titled To MVP and Beyond because I'm a principal product engineer at Shift 5. We are in the cybersecurity space for fleet vehicles, like military aircraft, ground vehicles, commercial airlines, trains. Basically, if it's moving in a large piece of equipment, we want to help protect it. So we are hiring. We have positions in not only web application development, but also machine learning if you have experience there. So come find me afterwards. But this is the talk about the different things that I learned over a year of building a LiveView MVP. The one thing to remember through this talk is that while I've been working on this MVP for about a year, I've had a fraction of the time of that year to work on it because I was doing everything. So I think the takeaway there is that LiveView is very fast to develop in my opinion. So why did we use LiveView? Well, we used it because I wanted to prioritize speed and agility, and I wanted to reduce the design burden. If you're doing a front-end app and a back-end app, you're going to have to design both of those architectures because they're going to be, they're going to need that. And with LiveView, I didn't have to do that. I saved a lot of time that way, and it really made me very agile, which was really nice. It accomplished prioritizing speed and agility. Also, we knew we might want to do real-time notifications. Now, that actually never panned out. We haven't done them yet, but that was one of the reasons we originally chose LiveView. And was LiveView the right choice for us? Yes, absolutely, it was the right choice for us. Over and over, it was the right choice for us because at one point, back in January and February, I believe I rewrote the entire front end 3 times in the period of 2 months because the domain was thrashing underneath us and we had some surprises. And those surprises meant that we had to change out like entire back-end data sources and that kind of thing. And so LiveView allowed me to accomplish all those goals. Also, the other reason it was the right choice is because when you don't know what you're building, being able to iterate really quickly is invaluable, right? Because you actually are spending more time defining your domain than you are writing code, and that's always great. And so there are just lots of reasons why LiveView was a great choice for us. Now, will we always use LiveView? I don't see a use case right now where we'd have to get off of LiveView, but it's possible because when data changes, you have to reassess your situation. The next thing I'm going to be doing is trying to spike out having microservices provide their own UI and then unify that in one UI service. I do want to spike that out because it's possible we're going to go down the microservices road. But so far, LiveView has met all the needs that we have, and until it fails to meet our needs, we'll keep using it. So there are some system concerns you have to know about in order to understand why I made some of the design choices I made. First, our use case will not have thousands of concurrent users. Instead, what we'll have are a handful of users in each deployment. We won't have one centralized deployment. The type of clients that we have require their data be separated completely from others, so we'll be deploying in GovCloud, we'll be deploying in AWS, we'll be deploying on-prem in some situations, and in some situations you're on-prem, but not only are you on the on-prem situation, but you can't actually ever see it deployed. You have to hand them the things, they go do the stuff. There's data in there I'm not allowed to see. So it's one of these things where you have to be ready for this thing to be deployed in pretty much any environment. That being the case, I couldn't start from the idea that I wasn't going to have a latency problem. because I had no idea what my environment that the on-prem apps were going to be deployed in. And if there was high latency UI choices with LiveView, who is the brain, like forms and different things like that, those choices are affected by latency. And so since I had that in front of me, you're going to see me possibly make different choices than other people make with LiveView. And because I don't have very many users, I'm not worried about, let's imagine you put one LiveView on a page. 1, 2, 5 of them. It doesn't matter, right? Because I have such a small user base, I'm never going to hit that resource load where I'm like, oh, I need to save a process, I need to not have another LiveView. Also, I'm not completely sold that that's a good argument anymore, but I'll get to that later. So those were the system concerns that I had, and they affected all my choices. I'm going to keep bringing that up mostly because I think that with LiveView, people try and lay out these hard and fast rules, and your environment determines all of that. So my background. I have full stack experience. I've done the front-end client-side frameworks before. I've worked someplace that had very high UI expectations. And why I mention this is because if you're going to evaluate a front-end framework, it'd be nice to know if you're going to really push the limits and try to make it slick, will it do that? You know, like getting out an enterprise product, I don't know who's worked in enterprise software, some of the things that pass for UI in enterprise software is it's just sad, right? So, LiveView being good enough for enterprise software, we were getting compliments on it immediately. On our first demo, we were getting compliments on how well it looked, right? But I knew that, like, imagine I was at a different company, imagine I had a different user base. Can I get the kind of UI responsiveness and the transitions that I'm needing? And I 100%, having gone through it for a year, I 100% believe you can. I'm not, but you can. I also had a lot of experience with CAP theorem. Whenever you're dealing with a distributed system and you have a lot of experience with the distributed async communication, it really helps you think about LiveView, because a lot of times, if you're mostly familiar with synchronous behavior, then that asynchronous communication and how the distributed system works, it can really get you. But I had a lot of that going in, and so if you're learning LiveView and you're struggling with some concepts, sometimes studying distributed systems just independent of LiveView is very helpful. And even after a year, I'm still not an expert. So we're going to start going over the building blocks of LiveView, but there are so much good documentation on LiveView. There are so many things written on it to get started. I'm not going to spend too much time here. I've got these three. Hold on, sorry, my hair is a thing. You called it. Am I on? Excellent. All right, so I'm not going to spend too long here. Everyone knows there are like 3 types, and you can even break it down further, talking about slots and that type of thing. Instead, I'd like to focus on the things that my brain kept chewing on as I worked on these problems. For example, live views versus live components. So you have one big parent live view, you're trying to figure out how you should split it down. You've got these different responsibilities, and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to break off some of the state, have somebody else manage it. Should I use a live component or should I use a live view? At first, when I started out in the year, I thought, you know, I'm going to follow best practices. Still don't know what those are, but I'm going to follow them, you know. And so I would listen to the people that were talking. I would listen to people that were leaders in the community. I'd hear what they were saying, and I would try to do what they were saying. So, when I started out, live view proliferation was like discouraged, right? In my use case, it doesn't really matter, but I was just trying to see how it works in even broader use cases. So I tried to use the live components. After a year of that, I'm going to say I'm not sure that there's a lot of benefit to them. And I'm happy to argue with whoever, because hopefully someone knows why they're so beneficial. I just can't figure it out anymore. Communication patterns are different between live views and live components. So when you have a parent live view and a child live view, and they're communicating together, one of them sends a message to one, the other one sends a message back, yay, very easy communication pattern. But when you're talking about live components, it's not the same thing. Sure, the live component can send a message to self, and that ends up at the parent live view. Totally makes sense. But now when the parent needs to talk to the child, it needs to talk to a child like in an update way, right? It's either going to update or change the assigns, which is going to trigger that update. And sometimes I found myself wanting more communication than that. And I felt clunky trying to shove the kind of communication. I felt like I was being really hacky. And so I'm kind of coming down to where if you think that you're going to have a lot of communication between things, I'm not quite sure you're going to want to use a live component, because they have a different communication pattern, and the patterns for live views communication is much easier. LiveView does cost you a process, but it gives you excellent isolation. When you're developing and you have live components in there, I'm not sure if this happens to you, but you ever find them re-rendering and you're like, why? Why? And then you have to go back and figure out what you changed in the assign to get them to stop re-rendering. LiveViews, if you use LiveViews, you don't have to worry about that. Kind of a hacky reason, but valid, especially if you're just trying to make time. So I'm not sure that about the value of live components anymore, and I would love to hear more on this. I'd love for someone to write a blog post, why Miki is wrong, okay? Love it, because I would like to understand it better. I'd also, if someone has information on why you should not proliferate LiveViews, I'd be very interested in hearing that too, because I'm just not seeing that pan out. So when you're starting to learn about your live components, I think these are the important things to know. If you're going to go and you're going to start fresh and start learning, life cycle is super important because it determines how things render, and those re-renders are going to get you out of the gate. How those components deal with state, like functional components don't have any state. I love them for that reason, but sometimes you need to deal with state. You need to make sure that your component that you're wanting to handle that is able to do it and to provide the necessary communication to any other dependencies in the app. So sometimes when you're dealing with a live view, the nice thing is the communication patterns are just kind of easier to reach for than a live component. You can still send messages to other things. I know there's ways to work around it. I've just found them clunky. And if you're going to start working on live view, you've got all these great places to be. And if you're not in the Elixir Slack, I highly recommend it. Oftentimes the community is really great and very helpful. Often when I first started, Michael Crum would chime in a lot with help. So much so that I started an internship for my daughter. She's right there. She went through my internship before she got hired at Simple Bet, and Michael Crump volunteered to help her and the other interns that were in there. So there's a big community here, so I'm not going to cover basic stuff. So I said earlier, and I'll reiterate, that hard and fast rules are hard to come by with LiveView, and I believe that because I think the deployment environments determine everything. When I read articles from fly.io, it totally makes sense why they're doing what they're doing. How they're deploying, how they have servers, and they have more of a low latency environment. That affects all their decisions. I'm actually going to show a component later that made a different decision than I made because of the fact that their environments are different. So when you're talking about LiveView, LiveView by itself doesn't solve any of the problems, and there's no like golden rule. Oh, you always do it in the LiveView, and then you will make a live component, or you always have a nested LiveView, or the server should always be the brain for everything. I'm going to hit that one later. But there's no hard and fast rule because I do ship the brains to the front end sometimes, and I make the front end responsible for state. You'll see that soon. But I'm going to say that hard and fast rules, they don't apply here. And so if you find yourself struggling with clarity of thought, your LiveView code is going to be a mess. It's not going to help you there. I think LiveView, some of the code organization things are still very young, and I'd like to see code organization, like better ideas around how you're going to organize all that code and do that to grow up. But if your thinking is muddy or not clear, your LiveView, it might work, but boy, is it going to be a mess. So if I were talking to someone about starting a new app, first thing I would ask is, how are we maintaining state? Because I think that really is the crux of all the LiveView stuff, especially for functional programmers. We should, if you're a good programmer, I'm going to say you should hate state. I hate state. I hate maintaining it. I'd rather just have all the transactions and add up a balance than have to maintain a balance, you know? And so I broke down state into 4 types. First, I have the state that's persisted or available on the server is another way to say it. So basically, a state that you're going to save off in your database, you have assurance that that state will be available to you later. URLs, if you're shoving params in the URL, now that state would be available if there's a socket disconnect or any kind of network partition that happens, that state will be available from the parameters, so that state will stick around. Also, if you have a client-side form and you have state in there, if you experience a disconnect and a reconnect, that form will hold the state. So it's kind of a weird one because I don't really like having much state in the front end, but I did start seeing forms as a hidden gem, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit. And then if it's not in one of the top 3, preferably in the top 2, it should be considered disposable, because on network partition, you could lose it. And so if you're not dividing up your state, or if you're handling state back in your socket, and that state isn't persisted or in the URL, you have to imagine if there was a socket disconnect, the likelihood is the user might experience some kind of weird jumpy behavior on the front end. And so there are some tools that I'm going to go over later on how you can check how does your page behave if there's a disconnect. Forms provide a contract, and I love them for this reason. I think that they are the hidden gem I think that there's a lot more that we could be doing with them as far as how our thinking patterns, because in a distributed system with all async communication, forms give you one of the only contracts you have. And that contract is when the user takes this specific action, pushes the button or submits the form somehow, this is the state they're seeing. Now, in a high latency, if you're in a low latency environment, you don't really worry about this, because updates to the state on the front end make it to the back end. You're not so much worried about possible race conditions or, I don't know, all the different things that happen when the hamsters are spinning the network. I don't know what's going on there, right? But if there's some weirdness, forms provide that contract that when the user pressed this button, this was what they were expecting to see happen as the parameters. In my case, I've got filters that they can select to sort things by. So I know that when they hit that submit button, those filters that I get in the submission, the form submission, are the exact filters they want, and there's no way for that to be off because the browser is locking it in as a contract. So I stayed away from forms when I first started out mostly because Michael Crum, he said something very ominous about them, and I was like, I'm just gonna put that out till later. But then when I got to them, I realized what I really liked about forms is they're one of the things that have a contract in the browser separate from LiveView. This is just a contract that always exists there. And so utilizing forms gives you that contract. So if you're making a new app, I would say the keys to success are clearly defining state ownership, considering the communication that's required between the state owners or different dependencies, and then trying to figure out how will your state be reconstituted if they're on reload or partition. Like, what is that user experience going to be? For me, what my fear is that I'm going to get an on-prem situation where it's deployed and there's high latency on the network for some reason. They've got Zoom running or something, I don't know. And then, bam, like they get partition and their page jumps and they think my product sucks because they just had really bad user experience. So when you're developing for these particular things, there are a couple of techniques you can use. The first one would be you can actually disconnect the socket from the console, and then you can reconnect it, and that will tell you what does the user see on network partition, or what does the user see if that socket connection breaks down. And then I also would simulate latency a lot. And this particular one is, the latency one is harder to work around, because if you put your brain in the back end, then that communication from the front to the back and then back to the front end again to control that state, I can get the UI to jump a little bit, and I'm going to show you that here soon. But before that, I'm going to go over some components. So at this point, I'm going to talk through some components that I made, talk about why I made the decisions that I made, talk about why I like them, all that kind of good stuff. The first one that I have is, first of all, if you don't know this, you missed a great skate night last night. There was a skate night, an adult night at Arvada Skate City. Good time. Anyway, I'm a big skater, love skating. I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet. So that's the theme of this amazing app. All right, so this is my amazing toggle. Now I'm going to play through this toggle, and what you're going to see is the toggle itself and all the hover states and all of that kind of stuff is completely controlled with CSS. So here I have no latency in my system, and you're going to see oftentimes I'm going from that DevTools on the right-hand side, the browser at the top, and then my terminal's underneath. And the reason that I did that is because you can see there's no latency. When something happens, it hits the server immediately. Now I'm going to bump the latency up. And you're going to see that this toggle now actually disables in between. And why I did this is because I didn't want a user to be able to toggle before it responded back from the server. So I wanted to lock the button down. So this toggle gave me a couple of things that I really liked. One, it really gave good signal to the user about where they were, like how they were interacting with the UI. When it locks the button down, I can use CSS to show that it's disabled. Also, this component has zero state. It's a functional component, and we'll take a look at it. So this is code from my live helpers file, and I just call it the auto submit toggle, because basically how I approach this, as I said, this toggle is actually a form with one input. And when they toggle that, we want to automatically save off whatever choice that is. So you'll see that I have a form there, and you'll notice when I dove into forms, I didn't do what a lot of people do with Ecto. If I was using it for database stuff, that would make way more sense to me, and I was able to use that. But when I was trying to use it for other things, like different selections on the page, it felt really clunky. And I couldn't, and I had to make a lot of time. I had a lot of work on my plate, and so I'm like, forget it. I'm just going to go right down to the forms and see how they work. And it worked really well. I'm very happy with how this worked out, because sometimes I think LiveView has a lot of great stuff in it, and sometimes I don't care when there's magic happening. But when I was trying to get this stuff working, sometimes the magic would throw me off, or I was trying to get down to understand more basic about the system without using the kind of the great little features that are built into Phoenix. I was having some issues. So I just went straight with forms. This is a one input form, and you'll notice that it has a Phoenix change event. That means as soon as someone toggles that input, that's an immediate change, it's going to go up to the server as a change event. And you'll also notice there's a hook here. So the Phoenix change event gave me my auto submission of the form, but the Phoenix hook, what that gave me was that when Phoenix adds the classes that of submit is loading, like when it adds that CSS class, then I could go ahead and disable the button. Because it's a purely functional component, right? So when the parent gets the update that the status is changing and makes the update and then updates the assign, it pushes that down, it's going to re-render the component, and the component will re-render without being disabled. So I like this little thing because it was nice, self-contained. I had good assurance about how it's working. It's working really well right now. I will grant you, it's not hardened yet, because if there's error in the back end, I haven't dealt with that. We'll do that later. The next component I'm going to talk about is my dropdown. So this dropdown is also another purely functional component. And what I like about it is that once I put this on a page, I don't have to think about it at all. This is completely controlled with CSS. So, you can put whatever you want. What's in the bottom div is simply any inner block that you want to throw in there. Whatever's with the component, it will go right in. So I use this with my dropdown, I use this with the checkboxes, and you'll see that soon. So what I liked about this component is I think it's a really good example of a functional component. And now I'm going to pick at another thing. One of the things I heard last year at ElixirConf was that we should try and put all of our functional components into Live Helpers, and we shouldn't make them separate modules. Now, it's also possible I heard that wrong, but I'm just going from there. So I found that my Live Helpers module, my Live Helpers file was just getting crazy out of control. And the little helper functions that you use to work with the templates, like what I have down here, like hide dropdown or toggle dropdown, it's really hard to figure out which ones those are talking about, because you end up with a bunch of them. And so I kind of came up with the idea that Live Helpers file would contain anything that was just a template. And if it was more than a template, if it was going to be something that had helper functions, I made a Live Helpers folder, I put the code in it, and then I would just pull it into Live Helpers this way. That way, Live Helpers was still my index for where I could find all the things and how they were being called, but I could separate up the code logically. And that worked pretty well. Then I came across this blog post. This blog post was made by someone at fly.io, and they made a reusable multi-select component. So I went ahead and grabbed the Git repo they had. If you go to do this, there's a hidden class on some CSS. You have to remove the hidden class or else it doesn't work. I didn't submit an issue or fix it. I know that makes me a bad person. I'm okay with that right now, but just know you might run this and hit a little problem with CSS. So this is how theirs works. You'll notice that when latency is 0, and I try and always show the latency in the bottom because I am always changing that in my console. So I have no latency. You can see the responsiveness of this is great. For a user, they're not going to have any problems with it. It's going to behave exactly as they're expecting. And again, I'm not trying to bash this component. For the environment it's deployed in, it's perfect, right? So, and this is another time where choices were made for that environment, totally works well. Also, this form uses Ecto, which was nice to see how that worked with something that wasn't coming out of the database and have a good example of that. But now you're going to see me bump up the latency to 500 milliseconds. And now, if I click the buttons fast enough, I can get them to jump around a little bit. You'll see where I'm doing stuff, and then the buttons will be changing on me there. Now you're saying, Miki, users don't do that. Well, you're only saying that if you haven't worked with very many users. Because we know that they do that. We know that they'll click around really fast and they'll experience that thing, and then it'll be like that. They have to go back and say, wait, did I really see that? And then they'll make it happen again, and then somehow they just can't stop making it happen. So what I was worried about is in an on-prem situation, this wouldn't work for me. The interesting thing was, by the time I saw this, I had already written my own multi-select drop-down type of component. And so when I looked at the code, I thought, oh, the brains in the back end, if I add the right amount of latency, I can mess this thing up. So I pulled it down to see if I could break it. And it actually held up better than I thought, from the sense that one thing this component gives you is that at the end, whatever your selections actually are the components this component shows you. The way they took and did the adding the selections was very smart. And that assured that at the end, it actually ends up in the right state. So that's good. But for me, I didn't want users to experience that jump. And more importantly, at my work, I'm kind of the, myself and my team, we're advocates for Elixir, but people are a little, LiveView's new and they're not quite sure about it. So I think that it's reasonable for my coworkers to try and push this thing and say, can this do what other frameworks do? Did you make a crappy choice? That's a valid question for them to ask. And one of the ways they can do that is by pushing these buttons really fast. So I kind of have to be prepared for users on-prem and also for people testing my choices in a good way. So this was the drop-down that I made. Now, just to go over, the reason why this jumps is because the selection goes to the server, then the server updates the selections on the front end and re-renders the components. And if there's a lot of time in between that, there's time for the user to select other things in the process. That's why you saw the buttons jump. But in my component, you'll see that there's no jumping, and you're going to see, remember, the dev console's on the right, the server's down below. Right now, there's no latency, and you can tell because it hits the server immediately. Now, I'm going to adjust the latency here soon and bump it up to, I think, 500 is what I was using for this. And then I'm going to clear that out so you can kind of see the output. And you'll see that no matter what happens, the front end, you can't even tell that, you can't tell at all that there's no jumping in state. It won't happen. And the reason for that is the front end here is controlling the form. And how I did that was, in the mount of the LiveView, I went ahead and set up the different options I'm going to pass into those checkboxes. And I handed them off to the checkboxes. You'll see I assign that config to the socket and the selections to the socket. And you'll see that my checkbox dropdown takes that config and takes the selections. And you can see that my actual component itself, it's in charge. There's nothing. This all lives on the front end once I ship it. So those checkboxes are the only thing that know their state. And the reason why that works is because I don't care about the state until the user pushes submit. If I cared about it or needed to validate it, maybe I need to do something there. But if you don't have to validate, you don't care about it till it's submitted, do you really want to have to pay the round trip cost, right? But you don't see a lot of people delegating the form behavior to the front end. You see the pattern of Ecto on the back, and you're like, oh, we're going to do Ecto all the time. And I think Ecto is great. It's just, if that's not your use case, do you need to do it that way? Can you get around some things by just shipping off the front end and not have to think about it? I say yes, and I like it that way. Okay. So this is what, then the challenge with this bumped up even more. Now, on this page, I have the same live component. You'll see it, the checkboxes are the live component. The submit button and all the green buttons are on the parent LiveView. Now, hold on one sec. The idea here was that when I click a button, I want to be able to change the component and mark that selection. So here what I have is add artistic, add rhythm, add speed. And if I click them, they should become now checked. And this is from the back end. And this all works pretty well, but I can actually break it. I think I'm getting to the point where I break it. Let's see, yeah, so here you'll notice I'm going to, down here you're going to see I'm highlighting the fact that the initial selections here are just as a list with artistic in it. That's the only initial selections. Now, if I unchecked artistic and then I click it again, doesn't matter how many times I click it, that is not going to check. And there's a reason for that, and it's a fun reason. What you notice when I click add rhythm, bam, I get rhythm and artistic. And now you're like, what? Why did that happen like that? And so this is an interesting thing when you're starting to play around with who's controlling the form. Like when it's at the LiveView and pushing down, that pathway is pretty clear. But when you put the brains down below and then you're trying to push more stuff down, it gets a little trickier. And that's what I learned here. And the reason why is you'll notice here in my mount of my LiveView that I give it selections, ignore that version line for right now. And then I also have this shadow copy of the selections called the form selections. So selections are actually what's getting passed in to render the component. Form selections is this shadow entity that I'm using in the LiveView just to track what's on the form. Now, when I get a validate event, meaning someone has interacted with the form, what I'm doing here is I'm not actually changing the selections. If I change the selections, it's going to push down a render to update the UI. I don't want to do that. I want the front end to control all that. But I do want to shadow listen. And so I'm listening, and then I put the new form selections on there. And then you can see the selections are passed in here. The selections equal my selections. But when I'm interacting with it, I'm going to go back and show the interaction again. Okay, so it's kind of, I don't know if I can, oh, I want to make it go faster, but I'm not going to be able to. So we're going to watch the whole demo again, and I'll tell you a joke. Well, let's get into the part. What does a pepper do when it gets angry? You are correct. It gets jalapeno face. I love that joke. All right, so we're going to get down to where once I refresh the page and it goes back to artistic, you're going to see what happens. So I think we're getting to that point. Well, this is taking a while. I don't know if this is worth it anymore. And now I've invested so much time, I got sunk cost, I have to wait. This is okay, so we're almost there. What's going to happen is I'm going to refresh the page, I'm going to unselect artistic, and then I'm going to try and add it from the bottom. Here you go, I'm unselecting. I'm showing you, first of all, I'm trying to highlight the fact that selections are just artistic. And then when I unselect it, what you're going to see is that down below, and the form selections just went to 0 because the back end, the shadow tracker is saying, oh, there's nothing there. Now when I go to add artistic, sure, it's artistic, but that's not different to the live component. What was the first thing passed into the live component for selections? The list with just artistic in it. What am I passing in now? The list with just artistic in it. Nothing has changed. The component will not re-render. So you'll see that here, and this is just a blow up of the console logging, is you have at selections you have artistic, and then I cleared out the selection, and then I selected again. And so as far as LiveView is concerned, the mounted selections and the selections that I end up with after add, identical. So it's not going to re-render. So I had to figure out a way around that. And so this is how I did that. Here it is. And this one I think I was better with making the demo because I think I go straight to the point, which is uncheck artistic, check artistic. Now I've got latency in the mix, and so it was slow checking it, but it was able to update it. And now I'm going to tell you how I did that, and then I'm going to tell you why I don't like it. So how I did that was, this was my original handle event for add, and in this handling of the event, I just update selections and form selections. But what I decided that I needed to do is kind of version the inputs coming in. That way, if the selections coming in were the same, but the version changed, it would pick it up and re-render that change. And I believe under the hood, with some of the form stuff that happens with Phoenix, similar ideas there. So here, you can see I passed the version into the component. And here in the mount of the component, or the update of the component, you'll see that I'm actually setting that container ID to contain that version. By including that version ID in my template markup, which is here, that means that when that changes, the page says, I have to re-render this. Now, after thinking, so just so you know, I've rewritten this talk, I think, 3 times now. First, I wrote it in July, and then I did throw it away last week, and then I wrote again, and then I came here, and then I talked to Desmond, and then I threw half of it away, and then I've done it again. And now, after finishing this talk, I do not like how I solved this problem. And the reason why is that I can still break it. I don't like it when I can break things, and the reason why is that I kind of mixed 2 patterns. I'm delegating it to the front end, but then I'm still using the parent to push it down. I think the better option here would have been to push down and update to the front end through the socket, and then call JS and actually say, hey, set the state on this component to this. Because then I feel like that's a more consistent pattern all the way around. If you're going to put it on the front end, really put it on the front end. So now I'm kind of interested to see how that works out. But that is my talk, and I can answer questions now.